Morrowind is beloved to many people. For a lot of them, it was their first time exploring Tamriel. But like all Bethesda RPGs, it has the capacity to be unpredictable and, at times, pretty spooky. Like all the Elder Scrolls games, it's a world built with intent, layered with shedloads of lore, and yet, over the years, it has become the source of fantastically spooky content, thanks to the stories and mysteries unearthed by players. Over the years, the myths of Morrowind have spread through late-night forum posts, yes, on a pre-Facebook, pre-Reddit, pre-everything modern version of the internet, spawning theories that refuse to die, evolving into a shared folklore unique to this game, but a folklore that will be familiar to those who've seen my other videos in this series. Inspired by the world of Vardenfell, stories emerged that are in turns spooky, glitchy, and of course, uncanny. Some are grounded enough to feel real, others spiral into the absurd, but they all feed into the mythos that grew around the game since its release, shaped by its players and completely unintended by its creators. For anyone who's played the game, it's clear that Morrowind carries its own flavour of mystery even without the addition of player speculation, often leaning into the eerie and the surreal. The stories I've chosen to cover are the tales that I've found the most interesting, that invite us to imagine a little further than even the strange world presented by the game itself. And of course, to top it all off, there's one of the most famous creepy game stories of all time, which we'll be exploring later in the video. So, let's get started. The first spooky tale we will look at from Morrowind has, I'm sure, been around for a while, but the earliest version of it I can find is from 2013. The rumour that Ranes Ienith, the Camonatong assassin, might be following you before he's meant to exist in the game. In the post, a player claimed they encountered the elusive Dark Elf far earlier than intended. The story begins as the player left Sedanin and ventured into the wilderness. Almost immediately they reported hearing footsteps, quick, purposeful, and unnervingly close. Every time they turned around, nothing was there. The sound stopped, only to start again as soon as they moved forward. This went on for hours, building tension until the player reached the Samaris ancestral tomb. Curious and on edge, they jumped backward, and there he was, Ranes Ienith, stuck in a tree, motionless but clearly there. For those unfamiliar, Ranes is a scripted NPC who only appears in quests tied to the Morag Tong or Thieves Guild, both of which involve the elimination of him and his brother Naval. His presence outside these quests raised immediate questions, especially since the footsteps reportedly stopped for good after Ranes was killed later in the game. There was a bit of discussion around this reported phenomenon. One camp believed that this was just a simple glitch, the kind you'd expect from Morrowind's famously janky AI. Some speculated that the game accidentally loaded Ranes into the world early, possibly with an invisibility effect, explaining the unseen footsteps. Another theory suggested a memory allocation error spawning Ranes far from his intended location. Yet, when modders examined Morrowind's construction set, they found no evidence of Ranes existing outside his scripted appearances in a normal playthrough. This behaviour has led some to wonder if an interaction between mods, save files, or overlapping quest triggers might cause him to spawn prematurely. However, players who've encountered this phenomenon insist they were playing an unmodded version of the game. Whatever the cause, there's something really creepy about the idea of being followed in general, and especially in a game like Morrowind. Vardenfell's lonely and at times bizarre landscapes already carry an air of quiet dread, and the thought of unseen eyes watching your every move only amplifies that feeling. The player's story of Rane's silent footsteps taps into and enhances that sense of paranoia. So, what makes this story stand out to me? Well, for one thing, while I could point to the plausibility as a glitch or programming quirk, which is completely believable for a Bethesda game, there's also the way it really vibes with the game's world and lore. The Camonatong, Ranes' faction, thrives on shadowy dealings and the perception of lurking threats. His reputation as an assassin who appears when you least expect him only adds to that resonance with the Morrowind vibes. To put it another way, even if the encounter wasn't intentional, it feels like it could have been. Have you ever experienced Ranes before you were supposed to? If so, share your story. And next, during my digital archaeological hunt for weird Morrowind stories, I came across some forum posts that were posted in 2005 and 6, where players shared strange and unexplained reports documenting glitches, odd encounters, and very unusual moments. We're going to be starting off fairly light on the terror and leaning more into the weird and wonderful with this set of oddities. So, let's take a look at some of these posts, getting a feel for some of the tales that emerged during those years. One player reported a pretty strange moment while jumping through Solstheim. After hitting a load point, every tree in the area suddenly disappeared, leaving behind a completely barren landscape. This vanishing act has apparently happened to others, but a variation of this, an account that stood out to me, while travelling from Caldera to Balmora, another player arrived to find nearly every door in the city missing. Nothing else was out of place, just the doors. The doors returned a short while later, of course. More than likely a glitch, but one that seemed worthy of mention in any case. Another strange tale involved a persistent hole in the Ashlands. While exploring, a player reported falling through the ground repeatedly in a specific area. No matter what they tried, their character couldn't walk on the surface. They simply kept falling over and over until levitating out of the void. Restarting their console resolved the issue, but the experience left enough of an impression for them to share it with the world. In another particularly strange report, a player created a new character and took a shortcut over the hill dividing Balmora from the main road. Instead of descending toward the city, they suddenly began walking up an invisible slope that rose far higher than any natural hill. The player described standing in midair looking down on Balmora from a height greater than the Fighters Guild. When they turned around, their character simply fell, plummeting back to the ground with no explanation. Attempts to recreate the incident failed, leaving the invisible hill an unsolved mystery. And yet another story tells of a glitch that involves fences behaving unpredictably. One player recalled jumping onto a fence and becoming stuck at the top. After a moment of struggling, they were launched into the air with such force that their character never came down. Hours later, the player returned to the game, only to find their character still suspended, drifting endlessly in the void. This next glitch, if you can call it that, has unsettled a number of players. While waiting for the game to load, the typical splash screen would sometimes be replaced with a stark white background displaying the letters HDI in large, crude text resembling spray paint. No one knows why this happens, but the randomness and weird presentation totally piqued my curiosity. When trying to dig further, I couldn't for the life of me find an image or video of this online anywhere. Either I'm incredibly unlucky or I couldn't see something that was staring me in the face. If you happen to know where to find evidence of this, let me know. Next, we're going back to the mechanics of the game world. Morrowind's interior cells sometimes hide cracks in their geometry, tiny, hard-to-see gaps that allow players to step out of bounds. One player described walking through a wall in a Morag-Tong building in Sadrith Mora, only to find themselves on an infinite plane. The plane mirrored the colour of the fog from the area they'd left, and while the player could move freely, jumping caused them to fall endlessly. They managed to re-enter the building by walking back toward it, but the sight of that featureless expanse stayed with them. For our next, no pun intended, noteworthy tale, occasionally players report a rare and completely bizarre bug tied to picking up items. On very rare occasions, looting something seemingly mundane triggers a message reading, "Name, it broke, please fix it. Todd." Immediately after, the game crashes to the desktop. The randomness of the items involved combined with the cryptic message left many players wondering whether this was an intentional Easter egg or a forgotten developer note. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any actual evidence for this anywhere, so I'm going to be relying on you, the viewers, to fill in the gaps if it's something you've encountered. Moving on, one of the most dramatic glitches that I found reported, and I don't think this is hyperbolic, involves Vivek and the Ministry of Truth. A player reported that they had killed Vivek and stepped outside only to witness the floating moon suddenly plummet to the ground. After crashing into the temple, the Ministry of Truth disappeared completely, leaving the city oddly intact. NPCs continued their routines, doors and structures remained in place, but the symbolic moon was gone. The sheer absurdity of the scene, combined with the player's stunned reaction, has made it one of my favourite little oddities to come across in my explorations of Morrowind player stories. I'd love to find some evidence or see this one happen on video. Another one I enjoyed coming across were reports of texture mods and experimental tinkering occasionally resulting in headless characters or invisible boots, reminding me of the headless gunner from Fallout 4. One player amusingly reported their werewolf transformation, leaving them with a butt-like neck. Hands down, one of my favourite descriptions of a glitch. Moving away from the glitchy to the theoretical, it was fun to come across discussions between players as to what aspects of Morrowind may have been inspired by or represented by other things. Yes, as much as we'll be looking at glitch-based urban legends that have been shared, as well as spooky tales, it's also interesting to look at what players have theorised about the game. The Elder Scrolls series has absolutely earned its reputation for intricate world building, and Morrowind is often celebrated by some fans as the pinnacle of this narrative achievement. From my perspective and many others, at its heart, Morrowind blends real-world history, religion, and philosophy into a fantastical setting, drawing on a vast array of cultural influences to shape its lore. These connections conspire to create a setting that feels simultaneously alien and very human, a weird juxtaposition, but it works. Discussions across communities like r/Tes lore and r/Morrowind have seen players come up with some fascinating parallels between Morrowind's lore and real-world histories, including Islamic traditions, Hindu philosophy, Sumerian civilization, and even biblical narratives. One that stands out to me lies in the dynamic between the Ashlanders and the Great Houses. The schism between the two groups runs deep, rooted in cultural and philosophical differences that have parallels in real-world history. Some have drawn comparisons between the Ashlander tribunal conflict and the Shia-Sunni divide in early Islamic history. Much like the Shia reverence for Ali and Hussein, the Ashlanders hold Nerevar as a betrayed, divinely chosen leader. This division also mirrors broader historical tensions between nomadic and urbanised societies. The Ashlanders' mobile, decentralised way of life recalls the nomadic Bedouin tribes, while the Great Houses, with their rigid hierarchies and urban centres, evoke the settled agricultural societies that have often clashed with nomadic cultures throughout human history. Vivek, one of Morrowind's and arguably the Elder Scrolls' most enigmatic figures, is perhaps the clearest example of the game's synthesis of cultural and philosophical ideas. Vivek's dual gender identity and divine role have drawn comparisons to, and I apologise if I butcher this name, Ardhanarishvara, the Hindu deity representing the unity of masculine and feminine principles. His weapon, the Muatra, is both creative and destructive, mirroring Shiva's trident or lingam. Beyond these Hindu influences, Vivek's philosophy incorporates the cyclical concepts of moksha and kalpas, reflecting ideas of liberation and cosmic renewal. More broadly speaking, we could also look at how the wider tribunal bears some similarities to the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, each representing different aspects of divine power. In some other player discussions, Gnostic and mystical traditions, they argue, are also deeply embedded in Vivek's character. The concept of Chim, a form of enlightenment that enables individuals to perceive their role within the universe without being consumed by it, aligns with the themes of Gnostic and Kabbalistic teachings. Vivek's 36 sermons further complicate his role, blending cryptic riddles, theology, and esotericism in a style reminiscent of Aleister Crowley's writings. This synthesis of mysticism, philosophy, and narrative puts Vivek at the intersection of religious and metaphysical tradition, making him quite possibly one of the most layered characters in the Elder Scrolls universe in terms of real-world inspiration. Biblical themes are also present. In my reading through player theories and discussions, I found the idea that the Chimer exodus from Somerset Isle could be compared to Moses leading the Israelites particularly interesting, which does tie in with the vibes in the game when you consider that the Nerevarine prophecy invokes the idea of a messianistic saviour designed to restore balance, something that is totally right at the core of what Christianity talks about. The Dwemer, with their advanced technology and mysterious disappearance, are frequently linked to the Sumerians, a culture that are super interesting and I'd recommend you read more into yourself. The Dwemer's mechanical creations and grand architectural style really encapsulate the poignant ingenuity of an ancient civilization lost to time. Daedric shrines like Baal Fel, with their mysterious names and ruins, suggested to some commenters a connection to Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Lagash. There is so much of this sort of discussion to be found all across the internet. With that being said, I find the possible historical parallels really interesting, and I'd be just as interested on your opinions on them, or your own theories I might not have mentioned. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Moving on, if you've spent time in Morrowind, you already know the game doesn't make anything easy. That's part of its charm. But for one player, the challenge reached a level that no sane person would willingly endure. The story revolves around what has to be one of the most ridiculous decisions ever made in the game, waiting for nearly 30,000 in-game hours to recover drained stats. The setup was simple enough. The player was exploring a cave and through poor planning or sheer bad luck had their stats drained to absolute zero. No strength, no intelligence, no speed, nothing. Worse still, they had no potions, magicka or other items to fix the problem. They were stuck. Most players would take the hint, reload an earlier save and call it a day, but not this person. Instead, they decided to wait it out, and I mean literally wait. Resting in-game hour by hour, watching the clock slowly tick forward as their stats recovered naturally. The process dragged on for 29,885 in-game hours. That's almost 3.5 years in Morrowind time. To be clear, they didn't play straight through these hours in real life, but the sheer determination or refusal to admit defeat to let their stats heal this way is astounding. Why they chose this route is anyone's guess. Maybe they didn't want to lose progress, maybe they were curious, or maybe they just wanted to see if it was possible. Regardless of the motivation, the result is one of the most absurd Morrowind stories out there. And there's a part of me that kinda doesn't believe it, but it's the kind of thing that perfectly sums up the game. Punishing, nonsensical, and somehow brilliant. And the best part? According to them, they did it. After all that time, their stats fully recovered and they carried on as if none of it had happened. Was it worth it? Probably not, but it makes a fantastic story in any case. Whether it's due to player decisions like the last story or unexplained glitches caused by the actual game itself, Morrowind is full of strange moments, but for one player, nothing quite compared to the bizarre invasion of cloned Nord women that took over their game. In a situation that reminds me of Louis Latruche and his clone invasion of Skyrim, two Nord women known only as Vinel and Surani started appearing across Vardenfell, multiplying into an army that turned cities into chaotic hotspots. At first it seemed subtle. One or two copies appeared in places like Balmora and Molag Mar, seemingly random additions to the landscape. But by the time the player arrived in Vivec, the glitch had spiralled out of control. Every canton was overrun with at least 3 versions of the women decked out in mismatched clothing and occasionally armed with greatswords. What started out as a minor oddity quickly became a surreal, omnipresent problem. The player tried to fight back. They taunted the clones into combat and dispatched them one by one with their trusty weapon. Each Nord dropped potions, which initially made the whole ordeal feel like a weirdly lucrative grind. Killing them also became an efficient way to grind stats as well. But no matter how many clones were slain, the moment the player revisited a city, the Nords were back, their numbers seemingly endless. As the spawns grew, the situation went from mildly amusing to outright irritating. Vivec in particular became almost unplayable, swarming with aggressive duplicates of Vinel and Surani. Desperate for a solution, the player turned to the Game FAQ's forums, suspecting their extensive mod list was to blame. They zeroed in on the less generic NPCs mod, popular overhaul designed to enrich dialogue and interactions, as the potential culprit. It seemed possible that a bug in the mod's scripting had caused these Nords to replicate endlessly, though others speculated a corrupted save file might have triggered the glitch instead. Ultimately, the true cause was never determined. Whatever the case, I love the story. In our next tale, we'll be looking at an experience shared in 2014 where a player, when experimenting with the construction set, turned Balmorra, one of Vardenfell's busiest cities, into something out of the Twilight Zone. What followed was a series of strange encounters that raised some questions online about the game's underlying mechanics, and is a really fantastic example of the occasional accidental emergent gameplay brilliance they could create. The incident began when the player returned to Balmorra after making adjustments in the construction set, not fully aware of the changes they'd introduced. Crossing the familiar bridge into the city, the west side seemed untouched, its NPCs going about their routines as though nothing had changed. However, the eastern side of the city, typically busy with Dunmer residents and bustling corner clubs, was completely devoid of life. Streets once alive with activity now felt spookily quiet, their emptiness amplifying the uncanny atmosphere. Curious, the player decided to investigate further. Entering a nearby corner club, they found the upper floor completely empty, its silence pressing in on them. But when they descended to the basement, the weird emptiness gave way to something far stranger. Ash zombies stood in the shadows, grotesque and utterly still, their presence entirely out of place in Balmorra. Rather than attacking the creatures outright, the player used a calm spell and approached cautiously. To their surprise, they were able to interact with the zombies. When prompted, the creatures spoke, breaking the silence with a cryptic plea. "Why can't you hear us, Dagoth Ur?" The words, loaded with desperation, seemed to hint at a deeper connection to the game's story, but the presence so far removed from the Ash zombies' usual layers remained unexplained. The words of the Ash zombies reminded me of an earlier story shared on the r/Morrowind subreddit. In this separate incident, a player in Coggerun reported sneaking up to an Ash zombie only to hear it whisper in a recorded voice line, "Let me sleep." The moment, which the player managed to replicate, revealed that some Ash creatures possess voice lines rarely heard during normal gameplay. While the specific voice clip could not be located in the game's construction set, it matched the tone and style of other dialogue, raising speculation about whether it was a hidden feature, an overlooked piece of cut content, or a quirk introduced by using Open Morrowind. Other players on the thread shared similar experiences, noting that camming Ash creatures often reveals rare text-based dialogue referencing their transformation, exhaustion, or connection to Dagoth Ur. Lines like, "I'm so tired, let me sleep," or "Speak to us please," add a pretty creepy feeling to these monsters, humanising them a bit and making it hard to ignore their suffering under the corruption. However, voice-acted lines like the one captured in Coggerun remain exceptionally rare, which sparked debates about whether engine differences in Open Morrowind or an obscure bug made them more likely to trigger. Returning to the Balmorra story, the player's discovery of Ash zombies in the city's abandoned eastern district led to more questions than answers. Had their edits in the construction set accidentally triggered a bizarre interaction between game elements, or was this the result of a corrupted save? The inclusion of the displaced Ash zombies and the weirdness exacerbated with their cryptic dialogue created a moment that felt more like something that could have been intended to happen, rather than just an insane glitch. While there are many documented encounters with cammable Ash creatures and their spooky dialogue lines, seeing them appear out of context in the heart of Balmorra obviously elevated the surrealist vibe of the entire story. Even if the whole incident was just a result of player interference mixed with the game's natural unpredictability, it's a cool story that I wish I'd experienced for myself. For our next tale, we're going to be going to a Dwemer ruin that I have always referred to as that one, because I cannot pronounce the name, but I'm going to show the word on the screen now. Now, this Dwemer ruin has always felt really spooky to me. For one player whose post was shared in 2014, what seemed to be a routine Mages Guild quest within its depths turned into something far stranger, causing a lot of speculation amongst other players when they shared their story. What ostensibly began as a straightforward journey to retrieve a book quickly escalated into a story that really caused some curiosity about what really resides in the forgotten ruins of Vardenfell. The The player's initial exploration was uneventful. They delved into the ruins' lower levels, moving towards their objective. Near the body of the quest target, a sudden spell struck them, cast by a shadowy figure that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. After reloading their save, they approached the area cautiously but found no trace of the shadow. Only the familiar clatter of a Dwemer spider broke the silence. It could have been dismissed as a one-off glitch, but what followed made the encounter a bit harder to explain. As they continued, brief glimpses of the figure began to appear. A flicker in the edge of their vision, or a faint silhouette under the light of Dwemer lamps hinted at its presence. The ambient sounds of the ruin that were already unsettling seemed to shift in tone. Faint breathing, rhythmic and deliberate, mixed with the sound of footsteps that always seemed just behind them. Turning to look revealed nothing, leaving the ruin feeling oppressive, as if something unseen was following their every move. The figure reappeared one last time as the player neared the exit. For a split second it stood directly in front of them before vanishing entirely. It was enough to leave the player shaken and searching for answers. When the player shared their story on forums, theories quickly emerged from other contributors. Some dismissed the experience as yet another example of Bethesda game engine quirks, speculating that the sounds and figure were simply the result of graphical or AI glitches. Misplaced light sources or bugged enemy paths could explain part of what they encountered, though these explanations left gaps. Most notably, how a phantom-like figure could cast a spell and vanish without a trace. Others tied the encounter to Morrowind's lore itself. Stories of Dwemer spirits haunting the ruins they left behind have circulated for years. The ghosts definitely exist, and players have speculated that such ghosts might linger as echoes of the Dwemer's mysterious disappearance, or may have died before it happened. The Shadow's apparent behaviour, fleeting appearances and magical attacks, aligned with what one might expect from a restless spectre. Though the aggressive use of magic stood out as odd for anything tied to the Dwemer, to some players who pointed out that the Dwemer relied on technology over sorcery. Though for the sake of completeness it should be pointed out that Dwemer spirits do actually use some magic when attacking. Some players offered a more whimsical explanation, suggesting Morrowind's sprawling world and unpredictable mechanics made it ripe for ghost stories, something that vibes with those who want to suspend their disbelief a bit. These players joked that any ghost trapped in the notoriously slow-loading Xbox version of the game would have abandoned it out of frustration. Despite the humour, such theories were clearly some light ribbing from fans used to the fact that the game's quirks often lend themselves to the unexplained, making it hard to separate technical issues from intentional design or player imagination. Whatever the explanation, the shadow in that ruin left enough of an impression on the player to take the time to share their story for posterity. And now, we're going to take a look at one of the most famous gaming urban legends of all time. The story of JVK1166Z.ESP, which I will shorten to JVK throughout the story, looms large in the annals of gaming folklore, without question one of the most iconic creepypastas to emerge from the gaming community. The story's proper spooky vibes cross-pollinated with Morrowind's already weird atmosphere were the perfect storm to really grab the attention of players across the internet. One of the hooks of the story is that, according to the narrative, it doesn't simply haunt the characters within the mod, but also bleeds into the real world. So settle down, because we're going to get into this story and it's going to be a long one. Most Morrowind mods have a clear origin: a forum post, a Nexus page, a discussion thread. But this one had nothing. No known creator, no public download, no explanation. It simply appeared, not on major sites but in private messages and obscure role-playing forums sent to people who hadn't even asked for it. According to the storyteller who shared the creepypasta originally, some people might recall the momentary buzz caused in 2009 by a particularly odd Morrowind mod. The file name was JVK116Z.ESP. It was never posted on any of the larger Elder Scrolls communities, only smaller boards and role-playing groups. I know in a few cases, rather than being posted, it was sent via PM or email to a chosen few. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. It was only up for a few days, to the best of my knowledge. No one knew where it came from. No one knew why it disappeared. But those who downloaded it in time were left with something they couldn't explain. For those who installed JVK, there was no grand reveal, no cryptic quest, no strange new lands to explore. Instead, the game simply broke. It caused a buzz because it was a virus, or seemed to be. At first, it was just the loading screen. Players sat waiting, expecting the game to start, but it never did. If you tried to load the game with the mod active, it would hang at the initial load screen for a full hour and then crash to the desktop. And that was only the beginning. If you were patient or just left the game running, something worse happened. If you let it get that far, your install of Morrowind along with any save files you had would become completely corrupted. The game was destroyed. Attempts to open the mod in the construction set, to look inside to see what it was meant to do, failed completely. With no way to fix it, the word spread fast. Eventually, warnings were distributed not to use it if you found it, and things died down. The mod disappeared again. Most people moved on, erasing it from their drives and from their memories, but not everyone. For almost a year, JVK was nothing more than a forgotten curiosity, a broken file that had corrupted a handful of Morrowind installs before vanishing into obscurity. But then, it came back. About a year later, in a mod board I used to frequent, someone popped up with the mod again. Where had it been all this time? No one knew, and the person who reintroduced it hadn't found it on an old hard drive or stumbled across a re-upload. They had been sent it directly. He said he was PM'd by a lurker who deleted his account immediately after sending. Whoever had sent it didn't want to be found, but they had included one crucial piece of advice. He also said that the person advised him to try playing it through DOSBox. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. There was no grand reveal, no dramatic changes, at least not visually. The game looked the same, but underneath, it had been fundamentally altered. The game was a bit laggy and you couldn't get into options, load game, the console, or really anything else other than the game itself. The quick save and quick load hot buttons worked, but that was it. And the quick save file seemed to be just part of the game file, so you couldn't get at it anymore. It was as if the game had locked itself. No way to adjust the settings, no way to use cheats, no way to back out. Some users online wondered why DOSBox was necessary to run it at all. Some speculated that the changed game used an older graphics renderer, making DOSBox necessary, but it didn't look any different. But none of that explained what was different. Only that it wasn't really Morrowind anymore. Up until this point, everything about JVK had been speculation, a corrupted file, a broken game, a strange dependency on DOSBox. But for the first time, someone was able to play it and share it with the world. This part I can speak about from personal experience. Our storyteller started a new game, woke up on the prison ship in Sedanin, walked through the character creation just like always. Everything seemed normal. Then they stepped outside. And that's when they saw the first sign that something was deeply wrong. Once you leave the starting bit in the census office and come into the game proper, the first thing you notice is that the prophecy has been severed box pops up. Morrowind is a game about fate, about fulfilling a prophecy, but in JVK, that prophecy no longer existed because there was no one left to fulfill it. This harks back to mistakes a player could make in the original game, where when locked out of being able to actually finish the main story, the message, "With this character's death, the thread of prophecy is severed," would appear. In the words of our storyteller, this is because every single NPC having to do with the main quest is dead, with the sole exception of Yagrum Bagarn, the last of the Dwemer. The game world was a graveyard. The corpses were everywhere. Red Mountain, Balmora, Vivec, the Ashlands. They simply remained forever frozen in place, lifeless remnants of a story that would never be told. Their corpses never despawn, so you can go check on all of them. There was no destiny to follow, no tribunal to speak with, no blades to offer guidance. Everyone integral to the main story was dead. This player wasn't stepping into an epic adventure filled with potential. They had entered a world already lost. In effect, you begin in a world that is doomed to start with. A world without a future was depressing enough, but it wasn't empty. Something was wrong. As well as all of the quest relevant characters being dead, there was something else that was wrong. The second thing you notice is that you're losing health. A few points every few moments. The kind of passive damage you'd expect from poison, a disease, something explainable. Except there was no status effect, no icon in the UI, and then it got worse. It's only a bit, but it keeps happening, a little bit at a time. The longer you stay in one place, the quicker it seems to occur. And it felt like it wasn't just happening, it was punishing the player for staying still. Something, some force or mechanic wanted them to keep moving. If they let the damage take them, the screen didn't fade to black like normal. Instead, they saw it. If you let this health loss kill you, you'll find the cause, a figure we came to call the assassin. It wasn't like anything else in the game. It wasn't standing, wasn't running, it was crawling. Its armour was black, but not like cloth or metal. Because he seems to wear a retextured version of the Dark Brotherhood armour from Tribunal, even though the expansions don't work in JVK. It's all black, completely untextured, like he's just a hole in space. Like the game had tried to give it form and failed, and then it moved. The way he moves gave me quite a start. The first time I saw him scuttling around my dead body, it was wrong. It felt wrong. He crawls inhumanly on his hands and feet, his arms and legs splayed out like a spider. The assassin would linger, climbing over the player's body as if inspecting them. Then, just before the game reloaded, it looked up, as if it knew it would see the player. You'd usually only see him after death, crawling around and over your body just before the reload box popped up. But death wasn't the only time it appeared. Occasionally you could catch a glimpse of him darting around a corner or crawling on a wall or ceiling. The assassin was always there, just out of reach, just out of sight, waiting. In the words of our storyteller, it made the game very difficult to play in the dark. It was becoming clearer that this was potentially much more than a broken mod, and something inside of it was watching the player. The assassin was always there, lurking, crawling, waiting, but there was something else happening. The world felt too still. Some NPCs behaved as they should, until night fell. Then without warning they left their homes. They stood motionless, scattered across towns and villages, their heads tilted up toward the sky, silent, unmoving, and if the player tried to speak to them, during this time the only thing they will say when hailed is, "Watch the sky." No explanation, no dialogue options, just those 3 words. Then, as suddenly as they had started this strange behaviour, it would stop. Once they returned to their normal behaviour, they act regularly though. It didn't happen every night. There was no pattern, and no reason. Just the growing, undeniable sense that the NPCs were waiting for something. One player on the forum went further. They explored Ghostgate, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. And that's where they found him. After a while, a player on the board discovered a new NPC named Tieris, a male Dunmer in the temple at Ghostgate. He wasn't like the others. He didn't go outside at night, he didn't say watch the sky, and he wasn't wearing normal robes. 2 things are notable about this NPC. First is his robe, a unique article of clothing that was lovingly rendered with twinkling stars all across it, looking like a torn off chunk of the night sky. His dialogue was fully voiced, a rare thing for Morrowind mods. Whoever had made this mod had gone to great lengths to make him feel real. Players made some interesting observations about Tieris's dialogue. You can skip it if you wish, but it all sounds like it's in the default male Dunmer voice. At first, players assumed it was a perfect match, but the more they listened, the more they weren't so sure. Some people said that they thought the voice was slightly different, but it was a very, very good imitation. It was close, but not quite right. Like someone, or something, was trying to sound convincingly familiar to Morrowind players. Tieras, as much as he was an anomaly, was also a guide. He had a purpose, and for the first time, the mod offered direction. I won't go into the details, but the questline he sends you on has to do with a dungeon referred to simply as the Citadel. Up until now, the mod had felt aimless. The world was dead, the prophecy severed, and the assassin always lurking. But Tieras provided something tangible, a place to go. And at first it seemed like a standard questline. Up until this point, the quests were all fairly generic discover the secrets of the ancients type. Nothing about this new quest suggested what was really waiting at the end. However, the Citadel itself was nowhere near the known landmarks of Morrowind. It wasn't hidden within Red Mountain or tucked away in some lost Daedric ruin. It was far from everything. The entrance to this dungeon is on a small island far to the west of Morrowind proper. There were no boats leading there, no roads, no map markers. The only way to reach it was through an exploit, something that felt intentional, as if the game wanted players to figure it out themselves. I eventually discovered that if you used a scroll of a carrion flight at the westernmost point on the main landmass and jumped directly west, you'd end up almost exactly at the island. A single miscalculation would send the player falling into the sea with no way back, but if they landed in the right place, they would find the entrance to the Citadel. And what was waiting inside was unlike anything else in Morrowind. The Citadel's name suggested something grand, a fortress towering above the landscape, but when the player stepped inside, they found nothing but a hole. Even though the dungeon is called the Citadel, it goes straight down. It seemed to be an endless pit. It dwarfs any other dungeon, both in size and difficulty. There were no grand halls, no courtyards, just a slow, terrifying descent into darkness. The first level was deceptively familiar. From a natural cave area, you'll proceed down into an ancestral tomb-looking area, then a Daedric ruin area, and then a Dwemer ruin area. At first, it felt like a normal dungeon crawl, but something about it was off. The further the player went, the more it became clear. This wasn't like any other dungeon in Morrowind. It wasn't leading to something, it was leading away. Away from the surface, away from everything familiar, and the deeper it went, the worse it got. I made it down to the Dwemer ruins before I quit. By the time the player reached that section, it was nearly impossible to continue. The creatures here were so strong that a level 20 character would have to take care, and since you can't use the console in JVK, level 20 took a while to get to. There was no way to cheat. No commands to adjust difficulty, no modifications to buff stats. The game was forcing the player to struggle, and if they made a mistake. Since quick save and quick load are your only options, it's all too easy to get yourself into an impossible situation too. Every step forward risked trapping them permanently, which is what happened to the player. I did, and I just didn't have the energy to start over. And so, they stopped. It seemed that no one was meant to reach the bottom of the Citadel. By the time most players reached the Dwemer ruins, they'd already given up, but a few kept going. And what they found wasn't normal. Our storyteller shares what these other players reported back from their own experiences. What I'm telling you now is based on the testimony of those few who went further. The structures continued, but the architecture changed. It looked like the Dwemer ruins, but everything had been drained of colour. Past the Dwemer ruins, you apparently find yourself in a level like the Dwemer ruins, but darker. Not just the walls, the machines, the pipes, even the creatures themselves. Rather than just the usual bronze, all the surfaces, including those of the creatures, are black. Not rusted, not shadowed, black. Like the textures had been stripped away, leaving only shapes moving blindly in the gloom, and the sound. The sounds of machinery are loud here and grow louder still randomly. Nothing in Morrowind was this loud. The hum of the ruins went beyond ambience. It was suffocating, surrounding the player from all sides. Then came the environmental effects. There's also steam or fog everywhere, limiting your vision to about 10 in-game feet or so. The path forward was nearly invisible. The deeper they went, the harder it was to see what was lurking just ahead. But if they made it through, they reached a place called the Portrait Room. There were no enemies here, no puzzles, just a long empty hall lined with picture frames. If you can make it through all this, you'll reach a room at the end of a hall. Those who found it called it the Portrait Room. At first glance, the images looked normal, but then players noticed something impossible. Like the fire and torches or other effects from early 3D games, this room has picture frames that always face directly at you, no matter how you look at them. No matter where the players stood, the portraits followed them. Then came the next realization. The images weren't from the game. The images in the frames are always randomly chosen images from your My Pictures folder. The player's own files. The player's own photos. The game was pulling images from their hard drive and displaying them in the game world. And that's where the fear turned into something else. Paranoia. Because if Morrowind could see into their files, what else was it looking at? On the board, the ones who got to this point had some fun posting screenshots of the portrait room with various pictures in the frames. For some, it was just a bizarre curiosity. For others, it was proof this wasn't just a game anymore. It was reaching back, and somewhere beyond that seemingly final room, something was waiting for them. The portrait room had no enemies, no danger, but it had one last feature. At the end of the hall, standing in the dim glow of flickering torches, was something else. At the end of the hall was a locked door. No key, no mechanism, just an impassable threshold, and the growing, gnawing feeling that something was on the other side. But there was no way forward. No matter what players tried, the door never opened. So they turned back. They climbed out of the depths, back into the dead world above. And when they returned to Tierras, hoping for an answer, after admitting defeat and returning to Tierras, he could be found saying, "Watch the sky," in his gravelly voice. Nothing else. No quest update, no explanation, just those words. And when they tried speaking to anyone else in the game, what's more, nobody else in the game would say anything. But it went beyond that. Talking to them would present a completely blank dialogue box with no options at all. Not even the standard greetings played. The world had fallen completely silent. Except, of course, for one exception. The NPCs still had something left to say. The only exception was at night. Whenever they'd go out for a few minutes, they'd repeat it. "Watch the sky." Something was happening up there in the sky. And one particular player, along with a few others, started their journey to figuring it out. In normal, unmodded Morrowind, the night sky was unchanging. The moons moved, the stars twinkled, but it was always the same sky. In the JVK version, it wasn't. At this point, one of the players, a friend of mine from the board, noticed, and a few others who got this far agreed, that the night sky was no longer the usual night sky of Tamriel. It was something else entirely. It had changed to a depiction of the real night sky, and it moved. Not like a standard game cycle where the skybox slowly shifts. This was different. It was tracking something specific, something the NPCs had been waiting for, something that was getting closer. From this point forward, JVK became less of a shared experience as most players had given up. The ones who had reached the portrait room found nothing but a locked door and a world that had fallen completely silent, but one player kept going. From this point on, everything is based on what this one person reported. He stayed in the game longer than anyone else, and as his obsession grew, his behaviour on the forums changed. Eventually he got himself kicked from the board, but I kept in contact with him for as long as he responded. At first his posts had been excited, unravelling the mystery piece by piece, but then something shifted. He was frustrated, restless, fixated. This remaining player wasn't simply watching a skybox. He was watching what seemed to be a representation of a real night sky. And when he started tracking it, he found something interesting. According to him, based on the constellations and planets, the sky started around February 2005. It seemingly wasn't random. The stars were moving in real time, as if the game had locked onto some kind of celestial clock. And if you died, reloaded, or left the Citadel, the sequence would start over again. The day sky froze the process, but as soon as night returned, the stars picked up where they left off. When the usual day sky graphics took over, the movement would be suspended until the stars appeared again. Every in-game night covered 2 months of movement in the real world. It was tracking something specific, but what? And if time was advancing, then what was going to happen when it reached the present? But beyond the sky and the mysteries that held, the locked door tormented this particular player. It had to mean something. And after they watched the stars shift for hours, he became convinced that the door would open based on some kind of celestial event. Something in the sky was the key, he thought. But if the game was moving in real time, that meant waiting for years, unless he sped things up. And the only way to do that, he would have to leave the game running for a full day. Of course, waiting for that meant leaving the game running. But that meant one major problem. Of course, that meant that the game couldn't be left unattended thanks to our old friend the assassin. The assassin, always there, always watching, always waiting. If the player left his character standing still, the health drain would kill him. If he let that happen, the game would reload, resetting the cycle. So he had to stay in the game. Moving, healing, constantly avoiding death. For 24 real hours. My friend decided he'd hang out for a whole day just to see if anything happened. That would be about a year's worth of movement. He thought he could handle it, but he didn't realise the game wasn't done changing. By the time the full day had passed, he had settled into a rhythm, healing when needed, moving around to keep the assassin from taking him, and then, without warning, I loaded into Sedanin, where it all starts. It wasn't too bad, just had to check in now and then to move around and heal and make sure I wasn't dying. Nothing had happened yet, until exactly 24 hours in. Then, the assassin did something new. But, check it out, 24 hours exactly in, the assassin learns a new trick. He screams. A shriek ripped through his speakers, something so sudden and inhuman it made him physically recoil. I was reading and all of a sudden this crazy loud shriek just about makes me cramp myself. And when he looked up, I look up and there he is, just crouched right down in front of me. For the first time, the assassin wasn't crawling on walls, lurking in the dark, watching from a distance. It had never been this close before. The second he moved, it scuttled away. Of course, the second I moved my character, he ran off. It was testing him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. And when he hurried back down to the portrait room, hoping the door had finally opened, when I went back down to the portrait room, the door was still locked. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Nothing had changed. The waiting wasn't over yet. 1 year of in-game time had passed. The locked door remained shut. The assassin had changed. It seemed like it was learning or adapting, and yet nothing new had happened. But the player had a new theory. A bit later, he came to the decision that he needed to wait 3 days, 3 years. He had been watching the stars shift, calculating their movement, and then he made the connection. The mysterious private message, the one that had resurfaced the mod in the first place, had arrived in February 2008. His reasoning was that the private message advising us to try DOSBox showed up in February of 2008. That was the point he needed to get to. Maybe if he reached that day in-game, the door would finally open, but that meant 3 more days in real time. 72 hours of non-stop playing, and with every passing hour, the game was becoming more aggressive. It had started with passive damage, draining the health if he stayed too long in one place. Then it began appearing more frequently, scuttling in the corners of his vision, and now after the scream, the assassin had become something else entirely. After the first shriek, the assassin stops hitting you out of nowhere. The health drain was gone. Instead, the assassin seemed like it was testing the player's reflexes. Now he'll shriek, and if you don't move for a few seconds after that, he hits you. It was forcing him to stay alert at all times. It didn't attack immediately, it waited. If he reacted fast enough, he was fine. If he didn't, he paid the price. I think whoever made the mod was trying to help. As if someone or something was guiding him, pushing him towards the end. The player felt that he had no choice but to endure it. 3 real-world days of the game running, of keeping himself awake, of never letting his character stand still for too long. And the assassin never let up. At night, I've got my headphones on and I was just kind of dozing off when he wakes me up with a shriek. I jiggle the mouse and I'm good. He couldn't sleep. If he did, the assassin would know. It was no longer simply an enemy in the game. It had become his guardian, his tormentor, his constant companion. Always there. And the countdown wasn't over yet. Eventually, the player had been awake for nearly 3 full days. The assassin's shrieks had become his alarm clock, jarring him back to consciousness whenever he began to drift. His body was exhausted, his mind fraying at the edges. And then, after 72 relentless hours, it finally happened. The moment he'd waited for, the final day arrived. And that's when he lost it. His final message was unhinged. Not careful, not calculated, just pure frustrated terror. I'm not going to read this message out, but you can see it on the screen. Because everything he'd been waiting for, everything he'd suffered through, had led to a whole new sequence of spooky events. So I wait the 3 days, right? And right after the effing assassin made me jiggle the mouse, he shrieks again. The game knew he was waiting. The townspeople had been repeating the same ritual for days, going outside, staring at the sky, whispering the same warning. But now, as he stepped into town, so I look and everyone in town is outside. All of them. And they were all saying it. They're all saying, watch the sky. But there was nothing up there, nothing he could see. However, then the world began to change. I don't see anything though, but then the game starts getting dark, like really dark. Not nightfall, not a storm, something else. A darkness that wasn't supposed to be there. I turn the brightness all the way up on my monitor and I can still barely see. Even with max brightness, the screen was swallowed in shadow. And in the distance, there are other people in the game, little figures running around in the distance, just going back and forth. Not NPCs, not enemies, just figures darting through the gloom. And if you tried to get closer, if I tried to get close, they run off. Whatever they were, they didn't want to be seen. The player had tried to keep playing. He'd come this far. He couldn't stop now. But the game was different. The darkness wasn't just in the game anymore. It was in his room, surrounding him in ways that felt wrong. He wanted to turn the light on, but I didn't want to get up to turn on my light because I didn't want to miss anything. So he kept playing and waited, but nothing effing happens. There was no event, no boss fight, no revelation, just this oppressive, endless darkness. He had one last idea. He decided to return to the Citadel. He made his way back to the island. Eventually I go to the Citadel. It was still dark and I had to swim. The figures were still there, darting beneath the water just out of reach. And the whole time I could see all these guys swimming all around me, just barely there. But when he reached inside of the dungeon, the darkness was gone. I make it to the Citadel and it's normal light inside and I get worried. And deep down he already knew what that meant, or so he thought. He rushed down, through the levels, past the ruins to the portrait room, to the locked door. And when he arrived, sure enough, the portrait door is still effing closed. Everything he had done, everything he'd endured, and it was still locked. The game had let him go through hell, only to seemingly trap him at the end. That was it. No answers. The door wasn't going to open. And the world outside had reset. I go outside and it's all starting over. All the suffering, all the paranoia, And for what? So that's it. I'm effing going to bed, and I'm effing done. The end. After 3 days of torment, he gave up. He had reached his limit. He had gone further than anyone else. And yet, the game still wasn't finished with him. Something had changed. After that, two things happened. Up until now, the assassin had been a horror contained within the mod. A crawling shadow lurking in its world, always there, always watching. But then, someone reported seeing it somewhere else, not inside JVK. Inside their normal Morrowind game. First, someone else who got to the portrait room claimed that the assassin was showing up in his regular game. They had installed JVK, reinstalled Morrowind into a fresh, untouched folder, and yet the assassin was still there. Quick explanation: if you reinstalled Morrowind to a different folder, you could have a normal Morrowind install along with JVK. At first, the player dismissed it. He himself chalked it up to an overactive imagination at first. But then, the sightings kept happening. But he reported a couple of really big scares with the black figure crawling right at him, or seeing it waiting just around a corner before scuttling off. It wasn't just random encounters. It was always positioned just right, waiting for the players to notice. Another of those who reached the portrait room started a regular Morrowind game, but never saw him for sure. It was just a couple of maybes late at night and always at a distance. Like the assassin wanted to be seen, just enough to make the players doubt whether it was really happening. Meanwhile, the original player, the one who'd gone the furthest, was changing too. But it didn't have anything to do with Morrowind. It wasn't about the game anymore. Something inside him himself had shifted. The second thing that happened is that my friend started getting really abusive and short-tempered on the board, though he stopped talking about JVK entirely. The game had consumed him for days. Now, even though he had quit, the frustration, the paranoia, the sleepless nights, those feelings hadn't left. He had reached the end and found nothing, and maybe that was worse than if something had happened. The others tried asking him about it, but he refused to talk. He shut them out completely. And then, it got so bad he was soon kicked off. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't just inside the game anymore. And when he disappeared from the board entirely, the person telling us this story reached out one last time. I didn't hear anything from him for a couple of weeks after that, so I sent him an email. For weeks, there was radio silence. No more posts, no more outbursts, no response to the email. Then finally, a reply. The player had gone back. I know I shouldn't have, but with classes out, I had some time, so I started JVK up again. And the mod had changed. Game time had moved on a number of years according to the sky. It's almost 2011, and I think I've got the sleep madness. The player had lost all sense of time, because now the world was locked in permanent night. But stuff is happening. It's still dark. Once it gets dark, it never gets any lighter. It stays like that. Daylight never came back. The eternal night had swallowed everything. And on top of that, the people of Morrowind had moved. NPCs weren't where they were supposed to be. Cities and towns were empty, but their inhabitants weren't gone. They had relocated as if driven underground. The people moved a few months ago. Everyone in Ranes just went to that little bandit cave and moved in. No longer in their homes, no longer living their normal lives. Instead, they had taken shelter in places they shouldn't be, and something about them was wrong. They killed the bandits inside, and now they're just standing around inside. Just standing, motionless, not speaking, not reacting. They don't say anything anymore. They don't do anything when you click on them. And when he tried to attack one, they didn't fight back. A quick save and killed one, and he just stood there until he died without fighting back. They had no will to resist, no purpose, like they'd been emptied out, left as lifeless husks. Ranes wasn't the only place this had happened, it was everywhere. There were no merchants, no guards patrolling the streets, nothing. The world's population had abandoned the surface. You have to walk since the quick travel people are all in caves now too. Those who once roamed the cities had fled into caves and tombs, and in Vivek, one of the largest cities in the game, everyone in Vivek is down in the sewers. The last remnants of civilization had been driven underground. They had hidden from something. There was only one person left in the game who might have answers. Tieris. If anyone knew what was happening, it had to be him. I'm going to Ghostgate next. I want to see if Tieris is still there. The player still believed there was something to find, that maybe Tieris was waiting for him, that he would finally explain what was happening. I'll tell you what he says when I get there. But Tieris had been silent before. Would he even still be there? And if he was, would he still be watching the sky? Or had he disappeared like the rest of the NPCs? Our storyteller wanted to know what happened next and reached back out to the player. I replied and said I wanted to see what he said too and waited a day. A full day passed in silence, then another. The player should have reported back by now, but he didn't. When I didn't get a reply, I mailed him again. Then, after hours of waiting, he finally responded. Time had kept moving. The game was accelerating towards something, and now it had reached 2014 in-game time. It had been in-game years since he first started tracking the sky. The stars never stopped shifting. Since it's always night, the stars are always moving. The entire world had descended into endless darkness, but yet some celestial objects could still be seen. The whole screen is dark, but you can still see the brightest stars moving around. But the biggest change? When the player finally reached Ghostgate on the hunt for the answers from Tieris, it was empty. Tieris was gone. Everyone in Ghostgate was gone. No one was left. Not in Ghostgate. Not in any of the nearby caves. I don't know where they went. They're not in any of the caves. It was as if they had been erased entirely. Whatever had been hunting them had seemingly finally taken them all. And the NPCs who remained in the world? They were worse off than before. They still couldn't speak. They still wouldn't react. But now there was something physically wrong with them. People still don't say anything, but their eyes are bleeding. Deep, dark streaks running down their faces, barely visible in the permanent blackness. It's so dark that even with a light spell, you have to get right up against them to see. He had to stand inches away from them just to make out the details, and yet they still didn't move, didn't react, didn't even acknowledge him. Something had been done to them. Something had taken their voices, their will, their purpose, and left only the bodies behind. The player should have quit, turned the game off for good, but he couldn't. He was completely obsessed. I think I've got to be getting close. He was so far in now that he had to see it through. I know this is stupid, and there's no way the payoff is going to be worth it. There was no logical reason to keep going. The game had given him nothing. Only dead ends, suffering, and unanswered questions, but it had its hooks on him now. It had taken his sleep, his time, his mind, and if he stopped now, that would mean it had won. But I just want to be able to say I stuck it out. He had convinced himself there had to be an end, that all of this was leading somewhere, that the door had to open eventually, and so he kept going. Even as the world crumbled around him, even as the game felt less and less like a game. Later that night, I received a follow-up email. The player was still awake, still playing, still trapped in the endless dying world of JVK, and now something was going wrong. For days the sky had been the only constant. It moved with precision, tracking something real, something important, but now even that was falling apart. Some of the planets aren't moving right. It's pissing me off. The pattern was broken. The celestial order, the only clue he had left, was drifting into chaos. If this keeps up, I won't be able to keep track anymore. The one thing he could count on was gone. Whatever was coming, whatever the game was leading to, he could no longer predict it. But it wasn't just the sky. The world itself had become a void, and the years were still ticking forward. It's almost 2015 now, I think. But now he wasn't tracking anything, he was just drifting further and further into nothing, because the world was truly empty. You know, I just now noticed that there aren't any monsters anymore either. The creatures, the ones that lurked in the caves, the ruins, the wilderness, they were gone. No cliff racers, no Kaguti, no Daedra. Nothing. I'm completely alone outside now. The world had been wiped clean, but one thing hadn't changed. One thing was still there. The corpses. The main quest people's bodies are still lying around though. I went to check on them. They were the last evidence that there had ever been any life. Unmoving, undisturbed, like they'd been left behind on purpose. Even with no more enemies, the game wasn't safe, because the assassin was still there, watching, as always, and now he was louder than ever. I don't need headphones anymore, so I just leave them off. Before, the sound had been isolated to the game, it was contained, but now, when he shrieks, it's like he's screaming right into my ear. The assassin wasn't in the game anymore, it was in his room. And worse, he was expecting it now. I think I even kind of anticipate it. He didn't jump anymore, didn't flinch. The game had trained him. The assassin's presence had become routine, and yet something was different. He's around a lot more now, a lot closer. It wasn't lurking in the distance anymore. It was right there. And there were still things moving in the dark. Not monsters, not NPCs. The shadowy figures that darted across the screen. Always on the edge of his vision, never close enough to see properly. They keep running around where I can barely see them. No matter how long he played, how deep into the game he went, they never stopped moving. The fearful and creepy experiences of the player continued to exist beyond being just simply in the game, but it got more intense. It was in his house. I have to admit, it's kind of creepy at night. It had followed him out of the screen, into the room around him, because when he stood up from his chair, when he walked through his own home, he could feel it. Sometimes when I go to the bathroom or whatever, I swear I can see something out of the corner of my eye. Something that wasn't really there. Something that moved like the figures in the game. Something that disappeared when he looked directly at it. And that's when he made a decision. I'm keeping all the lights on now. No more darkness. No more shadows. The last email had been disturbing, but he had still responded at least. Still reached out. Still seemed at least in some way in control. But after that night, the player was silent. I sent him a letter jokingly telling him to get some real sleep and left it at that. It was meant to be light-hearted, a joke, something to remind him that this was just a game. But he never responded, not the next day, not the day after, until 2 mornings later I found this in my email, and this time it was different. It was the last thing I got from him. After it, he stopped responding completely. No follow-ups, no explanations, nothing, because after this email, he was gone. The message was disjointed, confused, like he wasn't even sure what was real anymore. It started with a dream, or at least, that's what he thought it was. I just got up from some effed up dream, I think. It had started like before, the assassin's shriek, piercing through the dark, but this time when he opened his eyes, he was right there, crouching over me, not on the screen, not in the game, in his room, and the assassin was different now. It wasn't just a man in black armour anymore. His arms and legs were longer and more like a spider's. The thing that had haunted him from the start had fully transformed. It had grown, changed, became something else. I tried to push him away, but when I touched him, my hands went inside and I couldn't get them loose again, like he was made of tar or something. It wasn't solid. It wasn't even human-shaped anymore. It was something else entirely, something that was pulling him in. And then he woke up, or at least he thought he did. For a moment, from this player's perspective, it was over, just a nightmare. The kind of hallucination that comes from sleep deprivation and obsession. But then he looked at his screen, and what he saw wasn't his character standing in the world of Morrowind. He wasn't in his house either. He was inside the game. I was in the Corpusarium with Yagram. The bloated mechanical form of the last living Dwemer sat before him, and for once, the light was okay, and I could see him all bloated on those mechanical spider legs. The game world, the one that had been swallowed by darkness, was clear again, and then Yagram spoke to him, not through text boxes, not through dialogue options, directly. I sat down at the computer and he started talking to me, not in a box, but really talking to me in Tieris's voice. Tieris had vanished, Ghostgate was empty, but his voice remained through Yagram. And it knew him. He knew things about me. He told me things that I never told anyone, and some things I totally forgot about. The game seemed to have transcended being able to read files from people's computers. It was going directly into this player's mind. It knew him. It knew everything, and it told him the one thing he'd been waiting to hear. He told me that almost nobody had made it this far, and that the door would open up soon. The locked door, the one thing he had chased through the entire nightmare, it was about to open, I just had to hang on a little while longer, just a little longer, and he would finally see what was inside. But then I woke up for real, but I was at the computer. Everything should have been back to normal, but when he looked at the screen, he wasn't where he had last left his character. He wasn't in Ghostgate, or the Citadel, or even the portrait room. Right now, I'm swimming out to the Citadel Island. The game had taken him there on its own, and that's when he heard it. Even after all of this, even after everything this player had seen, this was the first time he sounded truly afraid, because now the horror was quantifiably not just in the game anymore. It was just outside his room. And I can hear this tapping. It's at my window. It was real. It was right there. It's over on the left, so I'm sending you this because I left my laptop by my bed to the right. His laptop was across the room. Whatever was outside that window, he was too afraid to turn and look. Just a little tap, 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 like he's knocking his finger against the glass. The assassin had been inside the game for so long, but now it was outside. It was real. And then, I might still be dreaming now. The player couldn't tell anymore. Where the game ended, where the dream ended, where reality began. And after that email, he never responded again. That was the last time anyone heard from him. He had disappeared, leaving only the emails, the story, the warning. For our storyteller, what was their comment? I guess that's the end of the story. Maybe it was just a mod for a game. Maybe the player finally walked away. Or maybe he finally found out what was behind the door. We can't know. I know there are a few other tales floating around about this mod. This is the only one I know as true as far as it goes. Our storyteller had deleted the mod long ago, but even after everything, even after all he had heard from the cursed player, he still couldn't shake the desire to explore further himself. I deleted my JVKey copy of the game pretty much after I gave up, but I'd like to get the mod again if anyone still has a copy of the file. Even knowing everything that happened, he still wanted to go back, because that's the nature of horror. It lingers, it calls you back, you can't look away. And no matter how terrifying the experience, there's something human about the final desire the storyteller expressed. I want to see some of this for myself. So, do you see what I mean? It's a really amazing example of the creepypasta genre. But the story doesn't end there. The community's response to JVK became as much a part of its legacy as the mod itself, elevating this terrifying narrative far beyond its original bounds into a collective, collaborative obsession. Forums and subreddits like r/watchtheskies sprang up, dedicated not only to analysing the creepypasta but also to dissecting its plausibility, theorising about its origins, and debating its deeper meanings. Players were captivated by the blend of eerie storytelling and grounded game mechanics which gave the tale an uncanny believability. Unlike many creepypastas, JVK didn't rely on the supernatural fully. It felt tethered to reality in a way that resonated with a tech-savvy audience familiar with the quirks of modding communities. Just plausible enough, I would say, although it did veer into that supernatural vibe towards the end. Discussions about the assassin dominated much of the conversation. His chilling design, a featureless, untextured void of a figure crawling inhumanly on hands and feet, was both simple and profoundly unsettling, and to be honest, the simplicity probably added to it. Players speculated about how he might have been scripted, theorising that his behaviours, like scuttling away when spotted or stalking the player only when idle, could be replicated using existing AI tools in the Morrowind construction set. Others debated his psychological impact on the players in the creepypasta, particularly his ability to appear fleetingly in corners of the screen or crouch over the player's corpse after death. His sudden piercing shrieks timed to unsettle players during periods of inattention were considered one of the creepypasta's most inspired elements, blending audio and visual to create a sense of persistently being on edge. This feature alone inspired many discussions about its potential impact in real gameplay. Another focal point of community discussion was the cryptic behaviour of NPCs. The idea that every non-essential character would abandon their routines nightly to gather outside and silently stare at the sky was really unnerving. When approached, their only words, "Watch the sky," felt absolutely laden with doom-filled cosmic dread, as though they were privy to some apocalyptic knowledge the player was excluded from. Theories bounced around. Was this a coded message, a warning about some celestial event, or simply a clever misdirection meant to heighten the atmosphere of paranoia? These debates extended into real-life interpretations, with some claiming the phrase symbolised the player's growing obsession with the mod itself, a metaphorical sky of unanswered questions. Tierras, the enigmatic NPC introduced by the mod, also became a subject of fascination. His shimmering, star-speckled robe and fully voiced dialogue lent him an air of importance, suggesting he might be a key to unlocking the mystery of the portrait room and the locked door within. Players theorised about his backstory and the significance of his cryptic instructions. Was he a gatekeeper, guarding the player from the horrors that lay beyond the door, or was he a manipulator leading the player towards inevitable doom? Some even speculated that he was tied to the assassin, representing a duality within the mod's narrative: light and dark, knowledge and madness. The portrait room too, with its really creepy feature of displaying images pulled from the player's hard drive, was another focus for analysis. Though many players recognised the technical improbability of such a feature within the Morrowind engine, the concept itself was recognised as a masterstroke of psychological horror. Players imagined how it might feel to encounter personal images in such an alien and hostile environment, violation of the boundary between the digital and the real. Discussions explored how such a mechanic could be implemented, with some proposing placeholder textures linked to specific file paths and others suggesting preloaded images disguised as player-specific content. And, amazingly enough, beyond discussions and debate online, the mythos surrounding JVK sparked into life an entire subculture devoted to recreating the mod itself. On platforms like Nexus Mods and Reddit, ambitious modders set out to bring the story to life, facing the dual challenge of staying faithful to the creepypasta while adapting it for practical use within Morrowind. Projects ranged from small isolated recreations of specific elements, like the assassin's AI or Tierras' dialogue, to full-scale attempts at realising the mod in its entirety. Creating the assassin proved to be one of the most difficult tasks. Modders debated how best to replicate his inhuman movement, with some suggesting retextured Dark Brotherhood armour and custom animations to give him an insect-like vibe. Others proposed making him a custom creature with stretched limbs, using Morrowind's scripting tools to control his AI and ensure he remained out of sight except during specific, terrifying moments. There were even discussions about using forced perspective tricks to make him appear briefly in the player's peripheral vision, though this idea was dismissed as too technically challenging for the time. Portrait Room presented a similar challenge. While the original creepypasta described it as pulling images from the player's own hard drive, this feature was widely regarded as impossible to implement within the Morrowind engine. As mentioned earlier, some modders provided alternative solutions, such as maybe randomised textures or preloaded images that gave that illusion of player-specific content, whereas others argued a different approach entirely, suggesting that the portrait room could contain abstract or distorted imagery with a view to making the player feel really uneasy. Despite these limitations, the room remained a staple of most recreation efforts, probably because it was pretty crucial to the supposedly fictional mod's central themes of intrusion and psychological manipulation. Tierras too became a focal point of modding projects. His dialogue, though sparsely detailed in the original story, provided an opportunity for creative expansion. Some players proposed giving him a fully fleshed out backstory tied to the lore of the Elder Scrolls, suggesting he might be a member of an ancient order tasked with guarding the Citadel and its dark secrets. Others envisioned him as a tragic figure burdened by his role and gradually succumbing to the same madness that claimed the player. His robe, described as shimmering with the light of the night sky, was another challenge. Modders experimented with animated textures to replicate its otherworldly experience. Beyond individual features, the larger goal of recreating JVK was to capture the oppressive atmosphere and creeping dread described in the creepypasta. Modders brainstormed ways to implement the mod's gradual world darkening, with ideas ranging from altering Morrowind's skybox to creating custom shaders that would progressively obscure the player's vision. The NPC behaviour, particularly their nightly vigils and eventual retreat into caves and tombs, required extensive scripting, but it was seen as a vital element in recreating the mod's sense of almost Lovecraftian unease. The locked door in the portrait room remained a subject of intense debate in terms of its implementation. Some modders wanted to leave it permanently sealed, preserving the mystery that made the original creepypasta so compelling. What you can't see is more terrifying than what's revealed, after all. On the flip side, others argued for creating an unlockable version, with the room behind the door serving as the mod's climax. Suggestions for its contents ranged from a final confrontation with the assassin to a revelation about the mod's true purpose. Regardless of the decision, the door weirdly became symbolic of the community's broader struggle, balancing the goal of being accurate to the spirit of the creepypasta with the need to create a playable, satisfying experience that offered some kind of payoff or closure. As projects progressed, forums were filled with detailed discussions about mechanics, lore, and design, with contributors sharing assets, scripts, and ideas. While many efforts stalled or remained incomplete, the work itself was clearly evidence of how impactful the story was. For the modding community, as much as the rest of the Morrowind community and gamers in general, JVK had grown beyond the bounds of being a story that you'd read to scratch the creepy itch. It was a challenge, an inspiration, and a shared experience that brought creators together in pursuit of a common goal. The legend of JVK completely transcends the boundaries of your common or garden creepypasta, existing simultaneously as a chilling story and also an absolutely remarkable example of media that's inspired fan-driven creativity. Whether or not the mod ever existed in its original form, its influence is undeniable, shaping how players engage with the Elder Scrolls and inspiring countless discussions, debates, and projects. In its blurring of the game world and reality, JVK for me captures the essence of what makes creepypasta so compelling as a format. Well, when it's done right. That special potential to transform and elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary and make us question the limits of our own perceptions. And beyond the blurring of the game world and the real world, something else that adds to the allure of JVK is its ability to bridge the gap between fiction and reality in terms of storytelling itself. It's a story that in some way, in some part, feels possible, firmly rooted in the existing mechanics and atmosphere of Morrowind. Players who've never experienced the mod still describe how the tale changed how they view the game. For example, Sixth's house bases became more unsettling, the desolation of Morrowind more pronounced. For some, the story inspired a renewed appreciation for the game's haunting beauty. For others, it created a sense of uneasiness that never quite faded. It basically made the entire experience a bit creepier overall. Ultimately for me, JVK represents the absolute cream of the crop of gaming creepypasta. It's got the thrill of discovery, the fear of the unknown, and the added bonus of the creativity of a community united by their love for a game. Whether the mod ever existed is almost irrelevant at this point. Its legend absolutely endures, and I know that many of you will agree with me in the comments. I am 100% expecting to read stories from people about when they first came across the creepypasta online years ago. And so, as we come to the end of our exploration of Morrowind's digital folklore, what stands out is how the mysteries, myths, and oddities we've covered, and all the others we haven't, have become, at least in my opinion, an absolutely integral part of the game's legacy. It's what's built around the games that make them feel more alive to me than the games themselves. These stories are, in a similar vein to those I've covered for the Fallout series and other Elder Scrolls entries, pieces of a shared history built by players over the years. They've taken on a life of their own, becoming the kind of folklore that complements and sometimes surpasses the official narrative. To me, it's almost like an AI gaining sentience. The fusion of the game with an outgrowth of folklore leads to a new beast. Something that's far more than the sum of its parts. Fundamentally, these stories create a sense of wonder. They ask us to look at a corner of Vardenfell, hear a strange sound, or stumble across an inexplicable event and think, what if? It's in these moments that the game world feels like far more than a collection of scripts and code. It becomes something vital and alive. So the next time you find yourself wandering Morrowind, keep an eye out for the unusual and listen closely to your gut when you feel a creepy vibe. You never know when you might stumble into a story waiting to be told, one you can share that's never been exposed to the light of day, immortalising you as one of the storytellers who are the building blocks of the online monument that is the collective history of Morrowind's legends.